associate. Okay. That's okay. Technical wizard. Are we good to go? Okay, so my research focuses on the evaluation of haptic devices and specifically user experience. So I'm really focus on the evaluation of user experience of using these things. Can I just look at who is involved with haptics? You all know of haptics? Yes, a little bit. Okay. So for haptic devices for the uninitiated, we're talking about technology that is replicating the sensations of touch and movement. In this case, I was interested for virtual reality, being the holy grail of being able to touch things in virtual reality, which was a very exciting place to be. Today, I'm going to share a bit of my research. So I'm going to primarily focus on a case study. But before I do that, I want to share with you some of my research that's just led up to that very briefly, and some of my findings along the way. Hopefully it will help you evaluate things and understand things a little bit better. And for the uninitiated, I'm going to sort of show you some examples, and it's not going to play. Ooh. Before I play this, I just want to say I'm just going to show you some examples of how haptics and VR technology is being used. But there's a little trigger warning. There's a little bit of graphic surgical stuff. So for those of you who are not into that, you might want to look away about halfway through it.
Let's move.
I mean, you're dealing with a generation that's very familiar with cell phones and video games and so forth, so this isn't foreign to them.
All right, move it up. All right, move up.
A couple hundred NYPD officers have taken part in this pilot training this first week. The goal is for police departments across the nation to endorse this tech so this training can be incorporated nationwide.
I had 10 colleagues from across the service join me virtually, where they were able to see what I was seeing and direct me to investigate the fire scene. It's an incredibly powerful learning tool for the fire investigators, quite an enjoyable process at the same time. So it's becoming a really, really good tool for us.
The virtual reality are that it actually provides you an element of stress that's not disabling to your learning. It also allows you to engage in what we refer to as productive failure. So you basically are allowed to make mistakes and then you learn from them. We compared VR to non-VR in senior trainees in orthopedic surgery, and then we had them perform that same procedure in cadavers. They were assessed by surgeons from across the country. And what they found was that clearly the VR group was superior in technical skill and in safety compared to the non-VR group. And interestingly, the virtual reality group also learned the information 570% faster.
About 3,000 people here watching all of you guys hanging out here in high fidelity. So let's spin the wheel. Let's see who wins an Oculus Rift right now. Let's do it.
Hello. I'm in my art here, painting. Don't you wish you were here in VR?
So as you can see, haptics has got great potential. There's a whole range of things. However, few people have actually used haptics in the general population, in the general public. It's quite specific. So the impact to society of having haptic technology and embedding it in things is largely unknown. A few things about haptics when we think about the experience, you know, largely when we're thinking about engineering, we're thinking about creating effects, but the user experience is just a different kettle of fish. When we touch something, we are in turn being touched. It's a two-way process. It's very loaded. There's a lot of intention there. Studies show that when somebody touches us, whether it's to reassure us, it has deep primal significance to us, and we can tell what somebody's mood's like just from the way that they touch us, just what they're telling us. It gives us a sense of agency. It gives us a sense of self-ownership. Also, touching confirms that things are real. If you're not sure whether something is real, you're kind of looking at something, you want to inspect and explore what the nature of that thing is. What is it made of? Is it a hallucination? Is there something strange and interesting going on? It gives us a sense of ownership towards our own limbs, and that sense of ownership can be appropriated to create embodied ownership of a virtual limb. So the rubber hand illusion, I've given you a link there, is one such body ownership illusion. One of my undergraduate pieces of study was to see if you could transfer your ownership of your own hand to a virtual hand or to anything else, and indeed you can. So there's lots of resources there if you want to give it a try. It's a classical psychology experiment where you can transfer the ownership of your hand to a virtual hand. And I would urge you to give it a go. It's a lot of fun, especially if you're doing it to somebody else. Touch is the first of our senses to be developed. So by comparison, eyesight takes 12 to 18 months. And even, babies in the womb, young babies can feel pain, for example. And that develops very quickly. Mechanoreceptors throughout the body are continuously transmitting information about where and what our limbs are doing in space. Effort, position, the control of your limbs, sense of force, sense of weight. And in fact, without the sense of touch, you wouldn't be able to do very basic things like doing the buttons up on your shirt, or just coordinating anything really. This is my favorite object, the sensory homunculus. I don't know if you've seen this chap before. I really like him. I specifically focus on, or in this particular research that I'm talking around, handheld devices such as controllers and wearable devices commonly used in VR. And as you can see from this, the amount of proportional, the proportion of the brain that's dedicated to hands is huge. And so this sort of made sense, and it's dedicated to them because they're an important exploratory instrument, right? We use them to interrogate everything else. So the skin is tailored to 8 senses. I'm going to read them off here. I'll forget one of them. Friction, touch, movement, pain, temperature, stretch, shape, weight, and density. And just for comparison, the best gloves only cater for 4 of those. So shape, density, touch, and movement. Other interesting facts, I do like the fact that we know that our skin weighs 8 pounds and these sorts of things. But I think what is more astonishing is 2-point discrimination. So our 2-point discrimination in the hands, 2PD, measures our ability to discern 2 distinct points as opposed to 1. And we can discern about 2 to 8 millimeters. And to kind of give you a point of reference, nanoreceptors detect skin displacement as small as 10 nanometers. And as a point of reference for that, because a lot of people deal with resolution, 1 pixel is approximately around 263,000 nanometers. So it's really, really fine. It's quite impressive. However, touch sensitivity and acuity diminishes quite often with age, and acuity actually differs from person to person. So if you're going to design something for a haptic user experience, you've really got to kind of take that into consideration. Unlike other organs in your body, it's distributed. And so really there's no one device that can cater for haptic needs. They're all kind of context specific. And subsequently, I mean, this is just some of them, many devices, and there are many, many more. So you could see here just a few. So the problem I'm sort of looking at is, so probably in my undergraduate study, I had this highfalutin idea that I was going to have these amazing haptic gloves and I was going to do this rubber hand illusion and it was going to be wonderful. And when I went to look at the haptic gloves, I think it was 2015, they were very expensive, but they were massively bulky and really, really noisy. And I couldn't understand why. Why are they like this? Why aren't they better? So I was a little underwhelmed. And so I went back. I thought maybe I can improve, maybe I can help them improve the design, and kind of went into this problem space. So to try and understand what is it that's going on. I did a state-of-the-art review just to understand what's going on. So existing studies already kind of indicate that hapticians struggle when it comes to evaluating user experience for haptics. So what is the haptic user experience? So I thought, well, what tools are out there? I did a state-of-the-art review, and it was looking at handheld devices, evaluations of haptics and VR specifically, and what do they return. And I did an inductive review, so an integrative review. So an integrative review is just really good at looking at whole range. Generally, systematic reviews are looking at quantitative data and quantitative studies, integrative, qualitative, mixed methods, all of this. And user experience evaluations tend to use quite a wide range of different types of methods. So you kind of want to capture them all. I think it was something like 1,702 articles, have to remember, between 2018 and 2020, looking at any handheld device, irrespective whether it was a sensor, a controller, or a glove. And in the end, the final review analysed 76 studies, 87 experiments. And what did we find? So within the actual studies themselves, they tend to focus in 4 areas, either experiential, physical aspects of haptics, the systems, or the task. However, performance, usability, those types of things were evaluated, I think, 2 to 1 against experience, physical, system, and task. So how is the system performing? What is the accuracy? What is the efficiency? All of those sorts of things. 72% of evaluations took purely quantitative approaches. So that in itself is a bit of a challenge if you're going to evaluate user experience, because you're not really looking at the experience that people have. You're looking at the numerical data of things that are being churned out, not the subjective experience of those users. Only 28% of the evaluations use qualitative methods to help explain results, understand the user's perspective. In addition, only 26 of the 76 studies defined their target users, and only 11 of the studies primarily within healthcare actually recruited them. What I actually found was that there was a very narrow age limit between 20 and 40, and predominantly male, and a lot of people were evaluating devices with other engineers, with other students at university, with other researchers, and so not really reflective of the general public and that variation that you would get with people from a range of different things. I suppose if you're wanting to test the performance or task efficiency, that's probably fine. But if you're evaluating user experience, it's not really going to be reflective, because those people are not reflective of the general population. The overarching unified statement from this was that quantitative and instrumental evaluations create challenges and opportunities in understanding haptic experience. If we're having challenges measuring haptic experience, part of that is we need to use the right methods to do so. We need to go about it in the right way. We need to have diverse populations of people that we're going to try and understand what their experience is like. And in fact, even when you look at experience, I mean, you see there's 26 there, and you go, wow, they're doing loads of experiential evaluations, but 50 of them aren't experience. And so these were doing evaluations with users, but primarily you see from the word cloud there, they mostly were focusing on usability. From the study, there was a taxonomy of 71 unique evaluation methods. So I looked at all the sources, all the range. Predominantly, these were questionnaires. Quite often, they were performance data or system performance data. I think there were only 4 studies of the 76 that actually did interviews at all, which struck me as slightly odd, but there you go. What I found quite interesting about these methods and the measures were that none of the methods I found, I was expecting going into this area to find unique methods designed to evaluate haptics. And I did not find them. There were none. There were no methods that were specifically designed to evaluate haptics or designed to evaluate user experience for haptics, which I just found really strange, because I thought, oh, I'm going to find some new and interesting methods here. They were not there. So, you know, and these were coming from haptic conferences, haptic engineering journals, all of these sorts of things. So that in itself was quite unusual. And I thought, why is that? And also, you know, for example, the closest I would say you would get to that is the just noticeable difference, the JND psychophysical assessment. But actually, that is designed for sensory limits. What's the difference between this and that? When can I notice the contrast has changed between this and this? Or like the beep test when you have a hearing test, or when you're at an optician's and they say, can you see the difference between this and that? There's a certain point at which you can't tell the difference anymore, and they use these kinds of tests for haptics, but they weren't designed for haptics. They are just psychophysical tests that hapticians use. But that's the closest to something where I went, oh, this is a little bit different from the usual methods. I just move on. However, since that review was done, in fact, over the last 2 years, and I include all the references to these in the notes for these slides, 4 tools have been developed. 4 tools have been developed, although they are not validated. There's a quantitative measure for vibrotactile user experience, and that's a questionnaire. It's a set series of scales, but it is quantitative, so you'll get some numbers. There's a UEQ, and it's added a little modular extension for acoustics and haptics on there. Very, very small, but it is there. There's a framework for measuring factors of realism fidelity for haptics in VR. That looks quite interesting, and it's qualitative and quantitative. And there's another framework for describing the fidelity of cutaneous haptics. So it's not operationalized, but it gives you some terms to describe some aspects of it. So I thought, well, why is this? What are they currently doing? What are the challenges that hapticians are facing? Why are they finding things so challenging? So I did an online survey. I did an online questionnaire during COVID times, but I also interviewed hapticians globally from different labs around the world. That was very interesting. One of the things that I did for the questionnaire was self-efficacy. So self-efficacy, as it mentions here, is a person's belief about their capability to successfully achieve a goal or task within a given domain. Now, the reason I'm interested in this is because there are specific activities that you need to do as part of an evaluation process, a standard process to get things. And self-efficacy specifically is about what a person can do or they feel capable of, not what they will do. So it's what they currently feel that they're capable of doing. And it's a very good predictor about what people might do or what they might be motivated to do. So what they will and won't do. And there are certain areas of things that they won't do. Self-efficacy, a sense of personal efficacy, is a belief in someone's capabilities. Exploring self-efficacy in the domain of haptic UX evaluation is useful in identifying areas where the hapticians feel less competent and therefore are less likely to pursue or put effort into any given activity. So I've developed this model from the existing standards of what the haptic user experience evaluation process is like. And you can see these common activities here. And so those were used to create a set of scales for self-efficacy and to just understand where they were at. There were a set of demographics, a set of self-efficacy scales, and a set of just user experience questions. The results from the questionnaire show that the activities from the evaluation process were prioritized in rank order of what they felt were the most important. So you see those there on the left. And on the right-hand side, you see the actual activities that they say themselves that they prioritize regularly. And you can see a lot of the user needs stuff that was placed at the top as being critically important is actually much further down in actuality of what they're doing. They're evaluating, they're checking and assessing the device. They're measuring user experience, but as we see there, many of those are quantitative. I did wonder if what they did in practice themselves was different from what were in the review of the papers, because what you put in a study paper isn't necessarily reflective of practice. And is that endemic, globally elsewhere in the population or not? But this seems to sort of indicate that they are evaluated with the end users, but they're very much interested in assessing the device and the performance. And you see recruiting end users specified for that device. So I'm creating a device for blind people, or I'm creating a device for certain. Are those the people that they're actually recruiting to test the device with? And this is at number 9 on the what they're actually doing kind of list. In the self-efficacy, when we look at it, generally speaking, you can see the different levels of experience and then the confidence at doing each of those tasks, the level of success they feel they're going to get, the level of anxiety. Interestingly, despite being the most anxious, hapticians with 5+ years of experience were more confident in their ability to be successful than experts with 8+ years, which I think might be an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So you get people right at the beginning, high anxiety, low confidence. In the middle, confidence shoots up, anxiety dips. With more senior people, the anxiety is really low, but their understanding of the probability of success is also slightly lower. And that's probably because they know what's doable and what isn't, and maybe some things just aren't. There's more complexity involved and less naivety. Expert hapticians report less anxiety regarding common UX evaluation tasks than less experience, which is, I guess, what we would hope to see. Some of the themes identified. So in interviewing them, this was actually the most useful. There's a lack of standardized measures that they can use, a lack of benchmarks for haptic user experience. What does good look like? How can you measure it? There are a lack of validated measures. People are unfamiliar with haptics. So you kind of almost have to train someone to use the haptics before they do a thing to tell you what it's like. People, fundamentally, there's an issue that people lack the words to describe their haptics and their haptic experience. Because it's an internalized thing, it's a personal thing, it's an intimate thing. Other than saying things feel strange, it's sticky, it's hard. But what was that experience like for you? It's very, very difficult to articulate, even the meaning and that transference of touching something to how it then feels. People just don't have a lexicon. They're not used to describing those things. We're very used to describing things we see, and we have a language to do that. We can say contrast, brightness, resolution, because we're used to looking at screens and things. But for this, people aren't used to it, and that's a fundamental issue. And I found that that's one of the reasons why a lot of hapticians, and by that I say anyone who designs, develops, or uses haptics, why they tend to steer away from doing these qualitative interviews, because the stuff they get is not necessarily that useful. You could argue, are they asking the right questions in the right way? Possibly not. But this seems to be just a challenge here. And people require training. So everyone, whether you are an expert or not, when you get a new haptic device, you've kind of got to have some level of training. You can't just use it. It's not like a mouse. And you see some of the excerpts there from things that people had mentioned. Some of the results, factors that were commonly measured. So these were the things that the hapticians reported that they commonly measured. And you see that you've got systems, some experiential stuff, but primarily usability, levels of satisfaction. And this is like, can you use it? Are you happy with it? Yes. And human comfort. So, but they're very kind of standard things and not massive amounts around the user experience. Things like embodiment, you would expect to have stuff like that, or even realism, not so much. Now, these were factors. So you see a lot more factors now that we said, what's important to haptic user experience? So versus what they measure to what they actually say is important, you still get very similar patterns. You've still got ergonomics, experiential. You do have more things there. Appropriateness, meaningfulness, emotion suddenly pops up, embodiment learning, and user experience. But what's specifically outside of that, not so much. So onto this is a bit more interesting, I think, for you guys, hopefully. So I undertook a study to test out some evaluation methods. I wanted to find out if a range of evaluation methods that we currently have would be capable of allowing hapticians consistently to evaluate haptic user experience, rather than just coming up with yet another new tool to add to the raft of new tools. What you found when you were talking to the hapticians about the ways in which they evaluated user experience, they were really, really different. They massive amount of variation, and subsequently it wasn't possible to compare one device or one experience with another one. They all were going about it a different way, simply because there's a lack of standards. So I'd identified, which we'll go through some components, and set about creating a virtual haptic training simulation for nursing. This is for a loop recorder insertion. It's a relatively simple procedure. It's where a small device, similar to a contraceptive implant, is inserted into the chest cavity to monitor the heart in case of abnormality. There's about 50,000 of these done in Scotland alone every year. Essentially, a little device is put there. The battery lasts for about 5 years. It transmits some data about your heart to an app. Your doctor can see it and he goes, right, John, there's a problem, you need to come in. Or you can go for that jog or that aerobics workout you were going to do because you know that you're not going to have some issue with your heart. So it's really, really useful. Currently, healthcare students watch somebody undertaking this procedure one time, and then they do it under supervision one time, and then they do it on, and then they're doing the procedure themselves on their own. So there isn't any kind of real training other than that available to them. And it makes it kind of ideal to kind of try and do some virtual training with them, see if we could do something. Healthcare has a long-standing history of employing haptic devices during training in the form of cadavers, mannequins, and models. And so this is just an extension of that. The efficacy of virtual training for medical procedures is well established as improving patient safety. There is an issue with cadavers, of course. You know, it's hard to get good cadavers. If you get a good cadaver, only one person can practice at a time. And if you have a poke about in a cadaver, well, that's it. You can't have another poke about. You kind of had it, and that's it. So this is really kind of helpful for them. So loop insertion device, you can see here on the left. So we just use Tinkercad to create something, and we create a 3D model to put in Unity and also print out to actually attach to this haptic touch stylus. So the haptic touch stylus has been used for a little while by surgeons primarily to practice procedures, and it's really useful because you can have two of them, you can attach different tools to them, scalpels, tweezers, and so on. So in this case, we attach the exact replica of the loop insertion device, and it gives them the exact same look, feel as the real thing. And then very helpfully, the haptic touch stylus already has an SDK in Unity with a whole raft of effects that you can use, so it's really handy. So if you want to very easily get into it, you can kind of go that route. These are the dimensions of haptic user experience that my research identified as being crucial to haptic user experience for VR. So you see them there, we have the joy of use, the hedonic aspects, ease of use, the pragmatic and eudaimonic purpose of use. Using something solely for the purpose. And what you see is that each of these things, those items listed under those components, realism, immersion, satisfaction, aesthetics, perceptibility of the haptics, safety, performance, wearability, handling, usability, well-being, and engagement are all components, and they all are creating emotional reactions, feelings, facial expressions, psychophysical responses, etc. And all of those things allow the person to have quality judgments about that particular experience, pleasure, the utility of it, the meaning of it, and ultimately that informs their usage behavior. Are they going to be motivated to use it, go back to it, and use it again? Basically, technology adoption. Of these 11 components, I'll describe very, very briefly what they include. So wearability is around the portability and the ergonomics, as we would probably expect. Handling includes control, stability, manipulation, and transparency. Where we're talking about transparency with haptics, what we're really talking about is the fact that if it is very transparent and handles very well, it will become invisible. It will not be noticeable. It will be a seamless interface. I will just be able to focus on the doing and not be focused on the fact there is an object doing it with me. Safety, I'll focus on that a little bit because it goes all the way through, is around the physical, psychological, and reputational. Now, the reason we say the psychological is on the physical side, you know, in many cases, haptic devices are manipulating the hand. So you've got issues there around fatigue to do with force. You've got issues there to do with RSI and things like that, where something is moving your hand or it's pushing against your hand and you're doing it repetitively. So, for example, if you were doing sort of training, industrial training or machine training for something in a virtual simulation, you were doing that for any extended period of time or even outside, you know, that may be an issue. Psychological in so much as, let's do a hypothetical here. I'm in the metaverse. Haptic devices are ubiquitous now. My kids have got them, I've got them, other people have got them. Technically, a complete stranger in a completely different place can interact with me physically. Now, when you think about social media space, anything we do socially, we take with us into whatever environment we're in. And so if people like getting your attention verbally or via typing, think how they'd feel if they could do it by physically getting a response from you. There's all sorts of things there, even from the point of view that there's some benefits there, you know, maybe we can interact with people long distance and things like that. But there are certainly some things we'd want to consider about the safety and the controls around those, the parameters of what people can deal with. Even physically, I might have undesirable effects that I don't like. I want to have some control over them. Perceptibility includes detection, recognition, clarity, and expressiveness of haptic effects. Usability, we're probably quite familiar with, the appropriateness, operability, learnability, accessibility, those kinds of things. Performance, effectiveness, efficiency. Again, we have transparency there to some degree. Realism, the affordances, synchronicity, and fidelity of the haptics within that. So do the haptic things, do they afford certain behaviors? Are they synchronized? Are they have a level of fidelity that you would want them to have? Immersion includes presence and embodiment, for VR particularly, satisfaction, pleasure, comfort, trust, usefulness, engagement, interest, challenge, curiosity, adoption, attention, and flow, which is very useful. Flow being the optimum user experience, and well-being. So well-being is a new one, it was added to the quality of experience standards. And this is really about users' physical, mental, psychological state is sustained or improved over time with use. Enabling the user to have autonomy to realize their goals in a meaningful, enjoyable way that is fulfilling. Okay. So what did we measure? So for this particular intervention, which I'm about to show you, we looked at safety, performance, usability, satisfaction, realism, and engagement. And to measure those things for safety, we went with the state trait anxiety inventory pre and post test. Now, anxiety is particularly useful for virtual reality for the simple reason that people who have high levels of anxiety prior to undertaking something in virtual reality is likely to break their levels of immersion, and they're also more likely to suffer from simulation sickness. So if you've got you may not know if you don't do a pre-test for it, but that could have some influence and impact on your final results. So testing for that beforehand and actually seeing what impact you've had on people's levels of anxiety post-hand, quite useful. Performance was sort of tested against the NASA TLX. We also have the SAS for satisfaction, a general usability study where we've given them a task, and afterwards a debriefing. The good, the bad, the ugly, what would they change, what did they like? And realism was with the visual analog scale. So I don't know if you've seen that, it's a very simple scale, completely not realistic, completely realistic, 10 centimeter scale, and they can literally just put a cross on it. And it's really, really useful, just getting a gauge of how realistic they felt that was. And then the flow. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with flow. So flow is the optimum level of user experience. It's when you're sort of in the zone. So it's an area where you lose your perception of maybe time, of doing something. It becomes enjoyable. You're just kind of intrinsically motivated to do it just because, just in of its own purpose. When people love what they're doing, they're more likely to participate, repeat their behavior, and execute tasks successfully. And obviously that's the important bit. So for technology adoption, if you can get people to enter into a state of flow, it shows that you've got a really optimal kind of experience that they're really able to get into. All right, okay, so I'm going to show you now virtual haptic training simulation. It's very basic simulation. They're looking at a chest cavity there with the loop insertion recorder. There were two versions, a normal and a gamified version designed to evoke engagement to positively affect user behavior through upbeat music for success and a dejected sigh for failure. The loop insertion procedure itself was completely identical for both groups. You're going to see a failed attempt and a successful attempt. And what I should identify here is that the skin and the objects in this scene are completely solid to the user, everything except for the incision. They've all had haptic textures and things applied to them. I think somebody had described the skin as dry cucumber, was what I was told at one point. It definitely wasn't mapped to be dry cucumber, but you can't see that, obviously, feel it, but hopefully you will be able to see it. Here's I'm picturing my machine, the background, the motors. So they've got to go in at an incline of 30 degrees, so it's quite flat. So when they insert the tool incorrectly into the incision, they will feel resistance force, forcibly pushing them back out of the incision. So they feel that they will even adjust them. It's quite funny because you could hear them doing that as well. Oh. Let's go to wide. So it was really designed to give them the motor skills. This is how you hold the tool. This is angle that you travel in. I learned things they got staying alive when they you had to give them a little reward, or to give them something. How did they do? Well, I mean, so this is the thing, right? It's a procedural thing. The reason why we get them to hold that steady and to go in at a certain angle, and they have to go in a certain way, and then they have to rotate it. So they have to go in like, so they have to rotate, then press, and they only have one hand, because in real life, they're holding the skin. So they just have that one hand. And it's really teaching them that motion and the stages at which they have to do it. So we get them to hold it. In reality, they would never hold it there. You know, they would do it, but we get them used to it. And what you see here is a traditional usability test wouldn't have given us this information. We see the number of attempts in the 10 minutes that they were allowed to practice. So you see all their attempts. If we just do this task one time, and we'll see how usable this is, it would have registered as this is terrible device. This is awful. It took them 4.5 minutes and they've made 49 errors and everyone's failed and it's terrible. But if you look at it consecutively, and you look at the time here, you see over the course of the 10 attempts, a dramatic improvement, a dramatic reduction in the time, in the number of failures, and in the number of faults. It clearly shows a trend that the initial attempt, although it was hard or it's challenging, over time, the number of errors, failures, everything else improves. So there's a good level of learnability, which is what you're looking for. The first attempt on this, I think it was 4.5 minutes on average, 49 errors, 5 failures. And by comparison, by the third attempt, took about a minute, average of 7 failures. And after the fourth attempt, there were no more failures. And you see this replicated in the procedural information as well, same pattern. The time they repeated the procedures, the number of attempts at insertions, the instability. So we've got system data, performance data, very, very useful. But only over time for tasks, right? Where you just do one, it's not really giving you an accurate reflection. That's really what I'm trying to indicate here with these approaches to evaluations. Similar, okay, benchmarks. I'm not a fan of benchmarks. Benchmarks are great, stakeholders, you can go with 3 points up or whatever else, but it doesn't really tell you massive amount about really what's going on. So we've got loads of benchmarks here. You've got gamified normal version. You can see the results there, and it was fair to middling, right? Good usability, low level of anxiety, medium workload, reasonably realistic. We got 2 significant figures at the bottom that were statistically significant. The gamified version was slightly better than the normal version, but I think we could have probably figured that out anyway, right? I think we could have guesstimated probably it was going to be possibly more engaging. And the flow state was slightly different. But if we interrogate things outside of just the averages and the scores, actually there are more useful ways for us to leverage this information. So if we look at the anxiety levels instead for each of the items and we look at them proportionally, and this isn't the way that the anxiety state trail normally works, it normally just gives you an average score. But if we look at it proportionally, you can see something interesting here. So all of the people in both groups were just fairly low anxiety, reasonably content and calm before they started. But post-test, we see a marked difference between the normal group, where 100% of them are content, relaxed and calm, and the gamified. Well, what we actually see is a change to 2/3, 71% are now moderately tense after the gamified training, and 14% are worried. So something's happened there. So this kind of indicates that aspects of gamification can actually make users more anxious than they were before they started. And it's just something to bear in mind, depending on what you're getting them to do on some kind of regular basis. But these results themselves are much more useful than just an overall score. In the flow state we looked at, we could see that there was a greater state of flow. But using a radar map for the same data actually more useful. What we can do is compare the normal experience to the gamified experience, and we can see what the shape of that experience was. So where we're looking at the different aspects of flow state for the different measures, we can see that certain aspects were much greater. And this is kind of showing that for the gamified version, they were much more likely to enter in a state of flow. And we say, well, why? Or what was happening there? Well, there's a loss of self-consciousness is greater. They became less self-conscious. There was a transformation in time to a certain degree, or that started to occur. Maybe that would have occurred more if they'd had longer, where they start to lose track of time. A lot of them were very surprised that, oh, it's over already. There's a merging of action and awareness where they're no longer thinking about what they're doing. They're just kind of doing it. It's all one process. So on another side, I want to talk about some common challenges with haptic UX evaluation, particularly in VR. You may or may not know some of these, so I'll go through them. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of a potential solution for describing haptics in another way. Latency is our enemy. So in all computing, latency is always our enemy, but particularly in VR and haptics, because you've got to synchronize what you can see and what you can touch. And the effect is given to me in my hand. I then have to respond to it. That device has to send that back to the VR and back again to me. I have to be able to see it. This continuous process. If there's any latency in this, you've got super duper processing going on and really good Wi-Fi. If you're not wired, you're going to have real issues. You know, you could have fishtailing with certain types of haptic devices, but generally speaking, it's all going to feel a bit out of kilter. You are not going to have a good user experience if everything is slightly behind what I need. I think it's, someone might be able to correct me, but I think it's something like 400 milliseconds that things have to occur for a human being to be in sync with the machine. And once it's outside of that range, it all gets a little bit awkward. Equipment calibration. So you can have sensors and things, you can measure things with EEG and stuff like that, but it's a whole new load of equipment and you've got to calibrate it for every single person. And you've got to calibrate stuff for touch. So you've got to calibrate to the person's the individual sense of touch. Can they perceive the thing that you are trying to share with them? And also location. So if you've got haptic gloves, people's hands aren't the same size, but haptic gloves tend to be one size, not all of them. Some of them are adjustable, but you've got to check that the bits of the glove are in the right place, or the bits of the sensors are on the right place. You've got to adjust that to the person. You can't just assume that that's going to work. Fatigue, repetitive strain, desensitization. If something's continuously touching or is in contact, after a while, the person might lose their sense of touch, or they're just not picking that up anymore. Breaking of immersion. So if you've got a group of people that are highly anxious and so on, or you're wearing lots of equipment, and also you can't use methods like think aloud. So in UX, HCI, quite often we'll use the think aloud method where people talk along, well, that's just going to break immersion. That's just not really a thing. If you want them to be in it and focused on the thing, they can't be talking to the person outside of the thing, outside of the environment. And then you've got the equipment, the weight, the noise. There's a lot of pneumatics, some of them have motors, some of them weigh a lot. I think one set of gloves I saw was 6 kilos, 6 kilo gloves. And then of course, if you've got a lot of participants, you've got hygiene. So you've got to clean everything down, people putting stuff on. Obviously you can get covers and things. It's just something you've got to be aware of. And this other challenge, which I've highlighted in bold here, is the participant being able to articulate what that experience was like, for you to get some actually useful data out at the other end. So I'm just going to share with you a little method that might help you.
So we have 10 more minutes remaining, so we want to keep some time also for questions. So
okay. I just want to lastly share with you this method. So this is a hybrid approach I developed to avoid breaking immersion while supporting users in trying to articulate their experience. It's a user-rated retrospective think aloud. I call it the Haptic, long time acronym. So what you can do is you can break up the experience into stages. And we have here, what was your experience like doing the thing using that particular device? 4 to excellent. And they can rate that. And what you do is you record the session, you play it back to them. As they go through it, they can rate each of the stages. How did they feel it was? And while they do that, you can talk to them. They do a retrospective thing. How did that feel? What were your thoughts? And then you can aggregate that information. And what you're essentially creating is a kind of user journey. It's a useful user journey. It can show you the different stages, and you can interrogate what's going on with their experience. It's much easier for them to articulate it when you break it down into little bits, and you get some quantitative data, you get some qualitative information. It's very simple to do, and it's quite useful. And here's some of the output you can get. So these are some of the hurt ratings. And what you can see here is the 2 different journeys over each of those stages, from first handling the tool, inserting it, rotating it, and so on. And you can see, interestingly, for inserting the tool under the skin, it seemed to be much more rewarding for the gamified group who finally managed to insert it than it was for the normal group. But on a larger scale, you can do as many stages as you want. it indicates potentially, here's a section of the journey, here's a section of the user experience that could be improved. And they maybe are listing some things that you could do to improve it, why it wasn't so good, why it was so good, how it felt to them. So I shall leave that with you. And voila, this is it. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions.
Thanks, Joanna, for the nice talk. So we have some time for questions. Also, people online, you can ask questions.
I'd be curious to know what you think the future of consumer VR haptics is going to be on the basis of your analysis of all, and also, given that future, do you have any concerns about the ethics of haptics contributing to greater perceptual realism, to some of the consumer experiences of people in VR headset?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think irrespective of whether Mark Zuckerberg's version of the metaverse took off or not, it is coming. It's going to come, because where are you going to take a 2D internet? And where you're going to commercialize things, you're going to take it into a 3D internet. There are just far too many applications, particularly for training, relational stuff, especially with COVID, really ramped that up. And the technology is now there. So, processing speeds and so on. Where's it going to go? You're getting a lot of soft electronics now, robotics, which I think is really interesting. You're getting a lot of electrical muscle stimulation for things just on the armband. They are looking to commercialize it, because how are you going to make, what is the holy grail of VR, right? It is touching virtual reality. That's where you get this greater level of engagement. That's where everybody wants to go. And when I look at haptic devices, the proliferation now is just really, really ramping up, and the technology is cheaper and cheaper. And so I think it's much more common now that people are starting to be able to buy different haptic devices. What does that mean? For me, yeah, I do have some concerns, not loads. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it. You can have long distance relationship with somebody, potentially you can interact with people. You can foster better relationship with people. You shake someone's hand at a very basic level, rudimentary level in a meeting or something like this, apart from the actual real applications of training. Longer term, what would it mean if everybody could touch people without really touching people? Well, I mean, for me, I think on an evolutionary basis, you can see things far away and you can touch things far away. You hear things far away, you don't touch things far away. And so what does that mean? If I don't need to really meet you intimately, physically, to have a relationship with you, I could have a long distance relationship with people, and maybe I never have to meet them. So I don't know what the impact of that is. I do think there's lots of benefits, like you could give your child a hug, even if you weren't able to be there, right? That people with dementia might be able to interact with people that they know, or people that have gone physically. That might, so I think there are lots of benefits. I think it's more about, are people considering some of those things? It seems to be that the technology is really outstripping a lot of the thoughts about, as with AI, right, whether we should do some of those things and the controls of some of those things. And I suppose that's where people from the HCI community, the UX community, start to try and traverse a little bit and go into other areas and think about those. So a little bit, but also I think it's very exciting. There's a massive amounts of potential.
We have a question online. Graham, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Okay. For now, maybe. Graham, are you there? Okay, so I'll just read out what you wrote.
Yeah.
Are the increased levels of anxiety after the gamified task potentially desirable, as they might more accurately reflect how a person would react in a real situation? I can imagine that trainee, novice, practitioners would feel increased anxiety after their early attempts.
Yes, that's completely true. Yeah, there are certain instances where there's a good level of stress, and you're going to expect them to have slightly more anxiety. They're doing something new equipment, new place, and they're trying to improve it. They're trying to acquire a skill. And at some points they were getting good at it. At some points it was very frustrating, and it's going to increase anxiety because they're kind of being judged to a certain degree with the sigh and the fanfare. Whereas the other people really weren't. It was completely silent. So there wasn't that, and things weren't highlighted in red, like you've done badly, right? They're all these numbers are red. So yeah, that's perfectly accurate. I think where it comes in is that if you're going to do things for prolonged periods of time, it's just to be aware that they do have these other psychological effects. If we didn't measure for that, we wouldn't know that that group of people had left much more stressed and worried. So, and depending on what experience, I guess, you're designing, that could be quite helpful to me.
I wanted to ask something that's quite helpful in audio engineering is the ability to visualize audio signal. So do you think there could be any way of visualizing haptics data or sensory data?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know how the person feels, but certainly things like trajectories and what you're doing or forces applied in system data. I do wonder whether there's a place where you can collect all that stuff as a visual analog of what's going on for the user. So maybe the user doesn't see that, but I could get an extraction of all of those environmental things that are happening. Because you're talking about it's a physical aspect, so there are physical forces. I don't know, that's obviously not really going to tell you how that was internally for them. It's one of the joys of touch, you know, you touch things all the time and they have a visceral effect on you, but nobody knows of that. So unless you share it, we don't know. Unless we go with Elon Musk brainwave, of course, which would be the ultimate interface. And then we would have all of that digitized information. So that's one way, perhaps, that you could actually directly interface, although I'm not sure I would want to.
But very quick. In the audio, you would sometimes have the same, that you can measure and visualize the audio, but you wouldn't know whether it's pleasant or not as well. Yes. But you can compute things like harmonics and consonance and dissonance.
Yes.
Maybe there could be similar parallels.
Yes, completely. Acoustics and haptics, you know, they sit processed at very similar places in the brain. Acoustics, you can even get away with replicating some forms of haptics in VR by playing the acoustics. Really, there's not with a switch or a click or something like this, and maybe you're not replicating that sensation, but to the user, it would feel the same way. So they're just very, very closely aligned. You know, if I give if I give a piece of wood that looks like a piece of wood, but there's no texture, and I give you a haptic stylus, you touch it, and it could be smooth like this table, but if I play the sound of wood, to them it's textured. If I played a slight rustling on that skin, to them it's dry skin, you know, even though it isn't, they're a simile almost for one another, they sit so closely. So completely, yes, this is true.
So it's now 2 p.m. So to come to a close, thank you again very much for the nice talk. Are you still around today for some time in class?
I am.
Okay, that's great. And we should have some tea and coffee outside. So please continue the chat. And unfortunately, I need to go, but please, speak with Joanna and make use of the opportunity just to that she is here. Okay, so thanks again. Let's.